A lot of people assume that when a man doesn't chase, it means he isn't interested. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's the exact opposite. Some men have learned that the strongest relationships don't begin with one person convincing the other to stay interested. They begin when two people are already walking toward each other. That changes everything. Because once a man starts looking for mutual interest instead of constant pursuit, his choices begin to look very different. And the first change is usually the one people misunderstand the most. Number one, he values mutual interest more than pursuit. There's a question that quietly changes the way a man approaches relationships. Not, how do I get her to like me, but is she genuinely interested in getting to know me too? At first, those questions sound almost identical. They're not. The first one keeps all of the attention on winning someone over. The second one asks whether the connection is growing from both sides. Imagine two different situations. In the first, he's always the one starting the conversation, always making the plans, always checking in first. He tells himself, maybe she's just busy, so he tries a little harder, then a little harder again. Eventually, every conversation starts feeling like something he has to keep alive by himself. Now imagine a different situation. He sends a message, she replies with genuine curiosity. He suggests meeting, she looks forward to it instead of making him guess. He shares something about himself, she opens up too. Notice what changed. It wasn't effort. There was still effort. It simply stopped belonging to one person. I think that's the kind of connection emotionally mature men begin looking for, not because they expect perfection, not because they keep score, because they've learned that interest has a way of revealing itself naturally. When someone is excited to know you, you don't have to keep wondering whether you're bothering them every time you reach out. The relationship starts feeling like a conversation, not a performance. That doesn't mean every text gets answered immediately. People have busy days. They forget. Life gets in the way. That's normal. What matters is something much simpler. Does she make room for you? Does she ask questions because she's genuinely curious? Does she remember things you've shared? Does it feel like she's building the connection with you or simply responding whenever it's convenient? Those are very different experiences. I've known men who believed persistence was the answer to everything. If she seemed distant, they chased harder. If she canceled plans, they made new ones. If she gave mixed signals, they convinced themselves they simply hadn't tried enough yet. For a while, it felt romantic. Then one day they realized something. You can't build closeness by carrying the entire relationship on your own. Real connection asks both people to move. Maybe not at the exact same pace, but in the same direction. That's why a man who has become emotionally secure doesn't lose interest because a woman doesn't play games. He loses interest when he's the only one investing. Not out of pride, out of self-respect. There's a quiet confidence in that. The confidence to stop asking, how can I make her choose me? And start asking, are we choosing each other? Because those are two completely different relationships. One is built on pursuit, the other is built on partnership. And once a man understands that difference, something else begins to change. He stops measuring his value by whether someone chooses him. Instead, he starts measuring it by something much healthier. Number two, he doesn't tie his self-worth to being chosen. There's something many people don't realize until much later in life. Rejection has a way of asking a very unfair question. What's wrong with me? It's almost automatic. Someone loses interest, doesn't call back, or chooses someone else, and before long the mind starts searching for an explanation. Maybe I wasn't attractive enough. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe if I had been more confident. It's a painful place to be, because when your self-worth depends on someone else's decision, every disappointment starts feeling personal. I've seen men stay in situations that stopped making them happy, not because they believed the relationship was right, but because walking away felt like admitting they weren't enough. So they kept trying. not to build a relationship, to prove their value. The problem is, those are two completely different goals. One is about connection, the other is about validation. And validation is difficult to satisfy. Because even if one person chooses you, you quietly begin worrying about losing that choice. You start second-guessing yourself. You become careful with every disagreement. You hesitate to express what you really think. Maybe you have a strong opinion about something. You start to say it, then you catch yourself and choose the safer answer instead. Not because you changed your mind, because somewhere along the way you started editing yourself to protect the relationship. And editing yourself is exhausting, especially when the person you're editing yourself for has no idea you are doing it. Not because you've changed, but because you're afraid of giving someone a reason to leave. That's an exhausting way to love. Then, at some point, something shifts. A man begins to understand that being chosen isn't the same as being worthy. Those are completely different things. Think about it this way. Have you ever met someone who was kind, honest, interesting, and still wasn't the right match for you? It didn't make them less valuable. It simply meant the connection wasn't right. The same is true in the other direction. Not every person who walks away is rejecting your worth. Sometimes they're simply making a different choice. Emotionally mature men eventually stop asking, "How do I become enough for her?" Instead, they ask, "Are we actually right for each other?" That question changes everything, because it puts both people on equal ground. He no longer sees himself as someone waiting to be accepted. He's also deciding. He's paying attention to whether the relationship brings out the best in both of them, whether there's mutual respect, whether there's peace, whether they genuinely enjoy building something together. That doesn't mean rejection suddenly becomes easy. It still hurts, and anyone who says otherwise probably isn't being honest. Losing someone you care about is painful. Disappointment is painful. But pain and self-worth are not the same thing. One difficult experience doesn't get to decide who you are. I've always admired people who can walk away from a relationship and still say, "I'm disappointed, but I don't think less of myself." There's a quiet strength in that. Not arrogance, not indifference, just the understanding that another person's choice doesn't define your value. Ironically, that's often when a man becomes more attractive, because he's no longer trying to earn love by proving he's enough. He's simply showing up as himself. And if that's appreciated, he's grateful. If it isn't, he doesn't spend months trying to convince someone to see what they don't see. He accepts that not every story is meant to continue. There's a freedom in that mindset, a freedom that allows him to care deeply without losing himself in the process. And once he stops chasing approval, he begins paying attention to something much more reliable than promises. He starts watching what people consistently do. Number 3. He pays more attention to actions than mixed signals. There's a point where a man realizes something that changes the way he sees relationships. Words can be sincere, intentions can be genuine, but neither of them builds trust on their own. Actions do. Think about how easy it is to explain away mixed signals. She's probably just busy. Maybe she's afraid of getting hurt. She said she likes me. Maybe I just need to be patient. At first, those thoughts feel hopeful. Then weeks turn into months. Nothing really changes. The conversations still come and go. The plans are still uncertain. The effort still feels one-sided. And he finds himself spending more time interpreting the relationship than actually enjoying it. That's when something clicks. He realizes he's been listening more to possibilities than to reality. Reality is much quieter. It's not hidden in complicated signals. It's found in simple questions. Does she make time for you? Does she follow through when she says she will? Does she show the same curiosity about your life that you show about hers? Not every day, not perfectly, just consistently enough that you don't have to keep guessing. I think that's one of the biggest differences between emotional maturity and emotional hope. Hope has a habit of filling in the blanks. It takes one thoughtful message and overlooks 3 weeks of distance. It holds on to one amazing date while ignoring the fact that nothing has moved forward since. We've all done it at some point, because hope can be comforting. It allows us to imagine the relationship we wish we had instead of accepting the one we're actually experiencing. But eventually, that becomes exhausting. Imagine a friend telling you, "She always says she can't wait to see me." You smile. Then you ask, "So, how often do you actually see each other?" He pauses. "Well, we've been trying to make plans for almost 2 months." Suddenly, the words don't carry the same weight anymore. Not because she was lying, because actions are where intentions become real. I've always thought genuine interest has a certain simplicity to it. You don't have to investigate it. You don't have to collect clues. You don't spend every evening wondering what someone's last message really meant. When someone wants to build something with you, their actions quietly remove the confusion. They make time. They keep showing up. They don't leave you carrying the relationship by yourself. That's why emotionally secure men stop chasing explanations for inconsistent behavior. Not because they've become cynical, because they've learned that explanations don't create relationships. Choices do. It's possible for someone to like you and still not be ready. It's possible for someone to have good intentions and still not give you what you're looking for. Both of those things can be true, but neither changes the experience of waiting for someone who isn't meeting you where you are. That's a difficult truth to accept, especially when you genuinely care about someone, because part of you wants to believe that one more conversation, one more chance, or one more month will finally change everything. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't, and there's wisdom in knowing the difference. A man who has learned this doesn't become cold. He doesn't stop believing people. He simply lets actions carry more weight than possibilities, because actions tell you where someone is today. Possibilities only tell you where you hope they'll be tomorrow. And once he starts trusting what he consistently sees instead of what he desperately wants to believe, making difficult decisions becomes much clearer, even if those decisions mean walking away from someone he genuinely cared about. And chief among those things is himself. Number 4, he'd rather lose the opportunity than lose himself. I think this is where everything comes together, because it's one thing to know what you want. It's another thing to walk away when you realize you're not getting it. That's the part most people struggle with. Imagine meeting someone who seems perfect. There's chemistry. The conversations are effortless. You genuinely enjoy being around her. For a while, it feels like this could become something real. Then, little by little, you notice what's happening. You're always adjusting your schedule. You're the one always reaching out after the silence. You're always wondering whether she still feels the same way. Without realizing it, your peace starts depending on someone else's inconsistency. At first, it doesn't seem like a big deal. You tell yourself, every relationship has its challenges. And that's true, they do. But there's a difference between working through challenges together and slowly abandoning yourself just to keep someone interested. That line is easy to miss. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small compromises. You stop bringing up things that bother you because you don't want to seem too much. You pretend you're okay with last-minute cancellations when you're actually disappointed. You convince yourself that asking for clarity is asking for too much. One day you look back and realize you've spent more energy protecting the relationship than protecting yourself. That's a painful realization, because love should ask you to grow. It shouldn't ask you to disappear. I've met men who stayed because they were afraid they'd never meet someone like her again. They weren't holding on to the relationship anymore. They were holding on to the possibility of what it could become. Those are two very different things. Hope can be beautiful, but hope can also keep you standing in a place you've already outgrown. Eventually, a healthier question begins to replace, "How do I make this work?" It becomes, "What is this costing me?" Not financially, emotionally. Your confidence, your self-respect, your peace, your ability to be yourself. Those things matter, more than many people realize. Because if building a relationship requires you to constantly betray your own needs, you're not building something healthy. You're slowly teaching yourself that love has to be earned by self-abandonment. And that's a lesson no one deserves to learn. The men who stop chasing aren't necessarily less romantic. If anything, many of them love deeply. They simply refuse to confuse love with losing themselves. They understand that being patient isn't the same as accepting anything, that commitment isn't the same as constant sacrifice, and that choosing someone else should never require unchoosing yourself. I think that's the psychology people often misunderstand. From the outside, it can look like he gave up too easily, like he wasn't willing to fight. But walking away isn't always the absence of love. Sometimes it's the presence of self-respect. Sometimes the hardest decision isn't staying, it's leaving someone you genuinely care about because the relationship is asking you to become someone you don't recognize. That takes courage. Not because it feels good, because it doesn't. There are no winners in that moment, just someone making the difficult choice to protect the life they'll have to live after the relationship ends. And perhaps that's what emotionally mature love really looks like. Not chasing someone until they finally choose you, not trying to convince someone of your worth, not endlessly decoding mixed signals, but showing up honestly, paying attention to what is real, and having enough respect for yourself to walk away when the relationship stops asking for partnership and starts asking for pieces of who you are. The irony is, people often assume men who don't chase are emotionally distant. Sometimes they're the opposite. Sometimes they've simply learned that love grows best when two people choose each other freely, not because one person refused to let go, but because neither person had to stop being themselves to make the relationship work. Because the man who doesn't chase isn't giving up on love. He's simply refusing to settle for a version of it that requires him to disappear in the process. So let me leave you with one question. Have you ever stayed in a situation long after you realized you were the only one holding it together? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.